Few men had the courage to enter the paths of the dead, but one such man was Baldor, the Heartless, Prince of Rohan. Today's video is about Baldor, son of Brego, not only a prince, but heir to the throne of Rohan. But he would never ascend the throne, as the dead of Dwemer would claim his life and leave his father grieving till he died. When Baldor was born, Rohan was still a young kingdom. Years ago, Baldor's grandfather, Eorl, a young lord of the antoher, had aided Gondor against the Easterlings, and thus been granted the land that is now known as Rohan. Eorl's son Brego had become king after Eorl's untimely death, and it was now under his rule. But in all directions there were enemies, orcs, Dunharrows, and Easterlings. Brego was a great king, and in his time his people still migrated into Rohan. He finished the Golden Hall of Meduseld and moved the capital to Edoras. When his first son was born, he was so happy, and Baldor quickly became very dear to him. Brego would later have two more sons, named Baldor and antoher. Baldor grew up quickly, but was prideful. Perhaps his father's love spoiled him. Baldor's pride grew with the years, and as many young men throughout the ages, he acted as if he were immortal. This sparkled a fear in Brego's heart, and he began to keep an eye on his reckless son and his whereabouts. One day in 2569, Brego and Baldor rode through Rohan, following the river Snowburn south to its source, and entered Harrowdale. It was empty and silent. Only the wind could be heard, and the wind whispered to them. They rode further south and saw the ancient structure of the Men of the Mountains, Dunharrow. Brego wanted to turn back, but in Baldor there was no fear to be found, and so he began climbing the stair of the hold. Brego worried for his son and followed with him. They came before the dark door. On the threshold sat an old man, aged beyond guess of years. Tall and kingly he had been, but now he was withered as an old stone. Indeed for stone they took him, for he moved not, and he said no word, until they sought to pass him by and enter. And then a voice came out of him, as it were out of the ground, and to their amaze it spoke in the western tongue. The way is shut. Then they halted and looked at him, and saw that he lived still. But he did not look at them. The way is shut, his voice said again. It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it, until the time comes. The way is shut. And when will that time be? Said Baldor. But no answer did he ever get, for the old man died in that hour, and fell upon his face. And no other tidings of the ancient dwellers in the mountains have the Rohirrim ever heard. Brego convinced his son to follow him back to Edoras, but Baldor could not forget the words of the old man, and his curiosity kept him awake at night. That same year, Meduseld stood finished, and Brego held a grand feast in the hall. All the lords of Rohan were invited, and the hall was full of laughter, cheering, and dancing. Baldor's brothers had come too, all the way from Eldberg. Baldor climbed his table near his father's seat. He stood with a full horn of meat, and bade them all to be silent. All laughter and cheering died out in the hall, and everybody turned towards the king and his heir. All eyes looked upon Baldor, but Brego's eyes were full of fear, for he knew what was troubling the mind of the young prince. Baldor vowed to tread the path of the dead and pass the dark door. He would not be taken by fear, he yelled, and drained his horn. Some men cheered, while others became silent. Brego tried to talk some sense into his son, but his words fell on deaf ears. The year after, when the last snow had melted, Baldor began to prepare. Baldor was clad in mail, with harness and gilded hauberk. His belt was of gold and garnets, and rich with gold was the helm upon his head. His sword, worthy of a king. It was of the finest quality in the land. He said farewell to his father and brothers at Meduseld. The people stood on either side of the road as he rode out the gate of Edoras towards Harrowdale. Like the year before, he found himself again before the dark door. His horse dared not go any further, so he sent it back to Edoras. He now stood alone at the entrance. With one hand he held a torch, and with the other his sword. He found the courage to enter the mountain and walk through the darkness with his torch held high. They were silent as the grave, no whispers as he had imagined. It encouraged him to move on even deeper into the darkness. He came to a room, and on the far wall he saw a great stone door hanging open. Through the doorway he could see vast treasures of unknown value. The darkness around him grew, and the fire from his torch dimmed down. The way behind him seemed to disappear. He walked towards the room, but the door began closing as he moved forward. He began running, but out of the darkness a long shadowy hand grabbed his legs and broke them both in one fell swoop. He fell near the far wall of the cave and screamed in agony. The door was still closing. He reached out, clawing at the cracks in it, but to no avail. The whispers around him laughed like they had set up a trap for him. Here the dead would leave him to die in the darkness. In his last despair, he hammered his sword into the rocky door. His sword was notched and broken, and he knew he had failed. There was no way out, and there Baldor the Heartless fell. Back in Edoras, Brego waited for his son's return, but he never did, and for each day that passed, his grief grew. His heart could not bear the loss of his son, and 1 year later, Brego, king of Rohan, died. And Baldur's younger brother, Aldor, became king. More than 400 years later, Aragorn and the Grey Company would dare to tread the path of the dead, and here they would find the corpse of Baldor exactly where he fell. Aragorn did not touch him, but after gazing silently for a while, he rose and sighed. Hither shall the flowers of simple moon come never unto world's end. 9 mounds and 7 there are now green with grass, and through all the long years he has lain at the door that he could not unlock. Whither does it lead? Why would he pass? None shall ever know.